palace stank of sickness and fear. It was the night of September 29th, 1833, and King Ferdinand VII of Spain lay on his deathbed, his body grotesquely swollen, his face discolored, his breathing ragged. Courtiers stood at a distance, their silken sleeves pulled over their mouths, as though the king's very breath carried a curse. The monarch who had once been called El Deseado, the Desired, was now a monstrous husk of a man, despised by many, pitied by few. His limbs were twisted with gout, his flesh rotted by years of disease and indulgence. Even in death, he seemed less a king than a grotesque warning, a reminder of how power and bloodlines could warp into something unspeakable. The candlelight flickered across the chamber, casting shadows that seemed to mock him. Outside the room, whispers spread through the corridors of the Escorial. The king was dying, the dynasty was breaking, and Spain itself teetered on the edge of civil war. What terrified them most was not his end, but what his end would unleash. His only surviving heir was a fragile young daughter, a child destined to rule a kingdom fractured between absolutists and liberals, monarchists and revolutionaries. And the grotesque legacy of Ferdinand's reign would haunt her every step. This was no ordinary deathbed. This was the collapse of a dynasty, poisoned by the body and mind of a man who had come to embody both tyranny and decay. For Spain, the nightmare was only beginning. But to understand why Ferdinand's final hours inspired such dread, we must go back. Back to the moment he first seized power, and to the shattered kingdom he inherited. Born in 1784, Ferdinand was a child of the Bourbon dynasty, but he was no golden prince. From the beginning, there were whispers of deformity, of weakness, of a body unfit for kingship. He grew into a man plagued by ill health, his body bloated and malformed, his temper cruel and suspicious. And yet, in the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, he became a symbol of hope. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain in 1808, forcing Ferdinand to abdicate and placing his own brother Joseph on the throne, the Spanish people turned to Ferdinand as their rallying figure. They called him El Deseado, the Desired One, the king who would free them from French tyranny. But hope is a dangerous weapon, and in Ferdinand's hands, it became a mask for something far darker. For when he returned to power after Napoleon's defeat, he would reveal himself not as a savior, but as a destroyer. The Spain he inherited was already fractured. The empire overseas was crumbling. Rebellions spread across the Americas. At home, liberals dreamed of a constitutional monarchy, while conservatives clung to the iron grip of absolutism. Into this fragile balance stepped Ferdinand, paranoid, vindictive, and utterly incapable of compromise. He restored the Inquisition, unleashed secret police, and filled prisons with dissenters. Executions returned to the plazas. Torture chambers reopened. Fear became the language of his court. Yet it was not merely political cruelty that made Ferdinand a nightmare. It was the grotesque spectacle of his own body and his dynastic fate. The king's health was a theatre of horror. Racked by gout, syphilis, and obesity, he became increasingly deformed as he aged. Courtiers whispered that his appearance was a punishment from God, a visible reflection of the corruption within. His marriages, 4 in total, became desperate, humiliating attempts to produce a male heir. Wives were examined by court, physicians, their fertility tested, their bodies treated like breeding stock. And still, the Bourbon bloodline faltered. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants that died before their first cries, all marked the royal nursery with grief and dread. When only one child survived, a daughter named Isabella, the seeds of Spain's future civil war were sown. The king's deformities were not just physical, they infected the very structure of his dynasty, his obsession with control, his paranoia toward reformers, his cruelty toward those who defied him. All these created a culture of fear that would outlast his reign. And as Ferdinand's body twisted into monstrous shapes, so too did the fate of Spain. This is the story of a king whose very flesh became a curse. a ruler once hailed as a savior who became a symbol of tyranny, deformity, and decay. A monarch whose deathbed was not an ending, but the beginning of one of Spain's bloodiest and most tragic chapters. For Ferdinand VII was not merely a deformed king, he was a nightmare that haunted his dynasty. And through his curse, he would plunge a kingdom into decades of war and ruin. And yet, as terrifying as his final hours were, the true horror of Ferdinand's reign lies in what he did while alive. For behind the palace walls, his reign was a theatre of paranoia, betrayal, and cruelty that would scar Spain for generations. And this is where our dark journey begins. When Ferdinand VII returned to Madrid in 1814, he was welcomed with tears of joy. Crowds lined the streets, throwing flowers, chanting his name, hailing him as El Deseado, the desired one, the king who would restore Spain's dignity after the humiliation of Napoleonic occupation. For a moment, it seemed the kingdom had been reborn. But that joy was short-lived. Within months, Ferdinand revealed his true nature, not a savior, but a tyrant who thrived on fear, manipulation, and cruelty. The Spain he entered was no longer the Spain he had left. During his captivity in France, reformers at home had drafted a new constitution in Cadiz, one that promised limits on royal authority, rights for citizens, and a shift toward modern governance. For liberals and intellectuals, it was the first glimmer of hope for a Spain that could finally escape the iron grip of absolutism. But for Ferdinand, the very idea of sharing power was intolerable. With a sweep of his pen, and with the backing of conservative nobles and clergy, Ferdinand abolished the Constitution of 1812. He declared absolute monarchy restored, cast aside the promises of reform, and branded the liberals who had fought for freedom as traitors. What followed was a purge that bled Spain of its brightest minds. Constitutionalists were dragged to prison, professors silenced, writers censored, and soldiers who had bled against Napoleon executed by their own king. Fear became Ferdinand's chosen weapon. His regime unleashed secret tribunals, torturers, and executioners with a ferocity that recalled the darkest days of the Inquisition. Dissidents vanished in the night, their bodies never recovered. Informers lurked in taverns and markets, whispering the names of those who dared question the throne. Under Ferdinand's reign, no one was safe, not nobles, not commoners, not even family. His paranoia infected every level of court life. Inside the royal palace, ministers quaked in fear. Ferdinand's temper was unpredictable, his suspicions endless. He dismissed advisors at the faintest hint of disloyalty, often replacing them with sycophants who cared more for survival than for governance. One misstep, one word out of place, could end a career or a life. In Ferdinand's Spain, loyalty was measured not by ability, but by how well one could grovel before the king's deformities and whims. What made this terror more grotesque was how it was dressed in ritual. Public executions became spectacles of loyalty to the crown. Priests blessed the hangman's rope. Crowds were forced to cheer as liberal soldiers and writers were shot or garroted. And Ferdinand's court congratulated itself for preserving order. Each act of cruelty was disguised as piety, each humiliation painted as justice. The message was clear: defy Ferdinand, and you would not only die, you would die branded as an enemy of God. But Ferdinand's cruelty was not reserved for political enemies alone. His personal life was a theatre of humiliation. Courtiers and even his wives endured the consequences of his paranoia. Physicians were ordered to conduct invasive and degrading examinations of his queens, parading their fertility as if it were a matter of state security. Whispers spread that Ferdinand, grotesquely deformed and diseased, was incapable of fathering healthy children. And yet, instead of easing suspicion, each miscarriage or stillbirth only deepened his paranoia. He accused enemies of witchcraft, conspiracies, or poison, refusing to see the truth, that his own blood carried the rot that cursed his line. This blend of political tyranny and private obsession created a court atmosphere more prison than palace. Ministers plotted behind closed doors, not in pursuit of reform, but for survival. Nobles clung to Ferdinand's favor with desperate flattery, while priests assured him that his reign was divinely ordained. Every humiliation he inflicted, on subjects, on rivals, even on his own family, was justified as a necessity to preserve Spain. But in reality, it was Ferdinand himself who was tearing the kingdom apart. There were early signs, too, that his cruelty would devour him from within. His paranoia deepened into isolation. He trusted no one fully, not his ministers, not his wives, not even his own brother Carlos. He increasingly withdrew into rituals of power, staged audiences where courtiers were forced to bow and scrape, proclamations that painted him as Spain's savior even as the empire collapsed overseas. Each ceremony was another mask, hiding the grotesque truth of a king who could not rule through respect, only through terror. And yet, even in this climate of fear, the seeds of downfall were already taking root. The liberals he hunted did not vanish. They went underground, plotting in secret, spreading pamphlets, and waiting for their moment. Soldiers executed in one city became martyrs in another. The whispers of dissent grew louder, despite the executions meant to silence them. Ferdinand's cruelty, rather than extinguishing rebellion, only fueled it. For a time, he believed himself untouchable. His body might have been twisted, but his crown was secure. His people might loathe him, but they feared him more. But power, built on paranoia, is power that eventually consumes itself. And Ferdinand's reign was slowly descending into madness, a madness that would one day explode in scandal, blood, and civil war. But the true horror of Ferdinand's reign was not in his everyday cruelty. It was in the grotesque scandal of his dynasty, the twisted marriages, the cursed heirs, the humiliations that turned Spain's royal family into a nightmare. And that horror was still to come. The court of Ferdinand VII was not merely a stage for politics. It was a grotesque theatre of the body, where the king's deformities, his obsession with heirs, and his twisted marriages played out like a slow-motion scandal. If his cruelty had scarred Spain, his personal life would curse his dynasty. For in the darkened chambers of the royal palace, Ferdinand's greatest horror unfolded, the desperate, humiliating struggle to produce a son, and the monstrous spectacle of a king whose diseased body betrayed him at every turn. Ferdinand married 4 times. Each marriage was not an act of love, but a political ritual, a frantic attempt to preserve the Bourbon bloodline. His queens were paraded like sacrificial victims, examined by court physicians, their fertility debated in whispers that echoed through Madrid's corridors. Their bodies became state property, their wombs instruments of dynastic survival. Yet, one by one, these marriages dissolved into tragedy. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, endured the full brunt of Ferdinand's paranoia. She was accused of plotting against him, whispered to be poisoned, and died young, her death marked by suspicion and fear. The court buzzed with rumors. Was she murdered? Was her body another victim of Ferdinand's vengeance? Or had she simply succumbed to the toxicity of life beside him? His second marriage to Maria Isabel of Portugal ended in a different kind of horror. She bore Ferdinand children, but none survived infancy. One stillbirth followed another. Courtiers described the royal nursery as a place of death, where the cries of mourning drowned out the cries of new life. Some whispered that Ferdinand's own grotesque deformities, his swollen body, his rumoured impotence, his rotting flesh, had cursed his seed. Physicians dared not speak the truth openly, but behind closed doors they admitted what Ferdinand never could. The king's bloodline was doomed. By the time of his third marriage to Maria Josepha of Saxony, Ferdinand's body was already a grotesque parody of kingship. Obese, ulcerated, tormented by gout, he became more a figure of pity than power. Maria Josepha died childless, another silent casualty of the Bourbon nightmare. Each death deepened Ferdinand's paranoia, driving him further into suspicion, cruelty, and denial. It was his fourth wife, Maria Cristina of Naples, who would bear the final legacy. In 1830, after years of miscarriages and infant deaths, she delivered a surviving child, a daughter, Isabella. The birth should have been a triumph, a glimmer of hope for a dying dynasty. But instead, it unleashed a scandal that would rip Spain apart. The problem was clear. Spain's Salic law forbade female succession. By tradition, the throne would pass not to Isabella, but to Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos. To secure Isabella's claim, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree overturning centuries of law, naming his daughter as heir. It was a desperate act, born of fear, and it lit the fuse of civil war. The court split into factions overnight. Absolutists rallied behind Don Carlos, declaring Isabella's succession an abomination. Liberals and moderates clung to the fragile hope of reform through the young princess. Ferdinand, bloated and dying, forced nobles to swear loyalty to Isabella, even as whispers filled the palace. The king was grotesque, his daughter illegitimate, the dynasty cursed. The scandal was not only legal but visceral. People could not forget the image of Ferdinand, deformed, diseased, grotesque, clinging to his infant daughter as if she were the last fragile thread of a rotting bloodline. In taverns and alleys, pamphlets spread depicting Ferdinand as a monster, his child a pawn, and Spain a kingdom condemned by the corruption of its king. For the people, the spectacle was unbearable. They had endured executions, censorship, and tyranny. But this grotesque parade of failed marriages, miscarriages, and desperate decrees revealed the dynasty itself as rotten to the core. It was as though Ferdinand's body had become a metaphor for Spain, bloated, diseased, and dying, unable to produce anything but death and division. When Isabella was proclaimed heir, the reaction was explosive. Some wept, believing a miracle had occurred. Others jeered, convinced it was a fraud. Soldiers muttered that they would not fight for a child. Priests thundered from pulpits that Spain was being led into sin. Nobles plotted in secret, waiting for Ferdinand to die so they could back Carlos and overthrow the infant queen. And through it all, Ferdinand sat in his throne room, swollen, grotesque, and defiant. He clutched Isabella like a talisman, the last desperate proof that his reign had not been a total failure. But even he must have known the truth. His dynasty was broken. His body had betrayed him. His kingdom was tearing itself apart. This was the scandal at the heart of Ferdinand's reign. A king so deformed, so consumed by paranoia, that his quest for heirs became a national curse. His marriages were not unions. They were funerals. His children were not blessings. They were omens of war. And his final decree, the Pragmatic Sanction, was not salvation. It was the spark that would ignite one of the bloodiest civil wars in Spain's history. But if the scandal of succession shattered the court, what came next was even darker. For behind the silken curtains of Ferdinand's palace, betrayal, conspiracy, and secret alliances would turn the king's final years into a grotesque carnival of intrigue, a theatre of treachery that pushed Spain to the brink of collapse. The scandal of succession did not simply divide Spain. It turned the royal court itself into a nest of treachery. Behind the velvet curtains of Ferdinand VII's palace, loyalty was an illusion, and every whispered word could be the beginning of betrayal. Ministers plotted not for the good of the kingdom, but for survival. Priests preached obedience in public, while spreading rumors in private. Nobles swore loyalty to Ferdinand's face, then toasted to his brother Carlos in candlelit chambers. The palace was not a sanctuary of monarchy. It was a labyrinth of conspiracies, a carnival of masks hiding daggers. At the center of this treacherous web stood Ferdinand himself, grotesque, deformed, and increasingly paranoid. His body was decaying, his mind spiraling into suspicion, and yet he clung to power with desperate claws. To protect Isabella's fragile claim, He demanded endless oaths of loyalty, forcing nobles and ministers to kneel before his daughter's cradle. But each oath sworn in daylight was broken by night. Behind closed doors, the courtiers whispered, "The king is cursed. His child cannot rule. Spain needs a true heir, a strong man, not the spawn of a dying monster." The rival claim of Don Carlos was the perfect poison. A strict absolutist, he embodied everything the conservative clergy and reactionary nobles desired: a male heir, untainted by liberal sympathies. In Carlos, they saw salvation. In Isabella, they saw disaster. And so, while Ferdinand rotted, factions formed in the shadows. The court became a chessboard, queens, bishops, and pawns maneuvering, waiting for the king to take his final breath so they could strike. The clergy were perhaps the most dangerous of all. They had long profited under Ferdinand's tyranny, blessing his executions, sanctifying his censorship, and turning his paranoia into divine will. But as his body decayed, their loyalty faltered. Secretly, bishops aligned with Carlist sympathizers, whispering that Isabella's claim was heresy, that God could not bless a female monarch. Sermons disguised as prophecies warned of the doom that would fall upon Spain if a child queen ascended the throne. These sermons spread through towns and villages, sowing seeds of rebellion before Isabella had even touched a crown. The duplicity reached into Ferdinand's own marriage bed. Queen Maria Cristina, Isabella's mother, played her role carefully. Outwardly, the dutiful wife, secretly a political operator. She knew Ferdinand's death would leave her daughter vulnerable, so she courted the liberals, striking secret pacts with reformist generals, promising them influence if they would defend Isabella's throne. In the same palace where priests denounced her as a Jezebel, she maneuvered with ruthless precision, weaving alliances in the shadows to outmaneuver Carlos's supporters. The atmosphere inside the palace was one of suffocating dread. Each day began with audiences where nobles bowed, kissed Ferdinand's deformed hand, and mouthed their loyalty. Each night ended with secret meetings, conspirators bending over candlelight, maps and letters scattered across tables, their voices hushed but urgent. The palace walls echoed with lies. Courtiers smiled in the throne room, then whispered treason in the corridors. Even the physicians who attended Ferdinand were drawn into this theatre of deceit. Officially, they reported the king's health in cautious, hopeful tones. Unofficially, they admitted he was beyond saving. His body swollen with fluids, his legs ulcerated, his breath labored. Some were bribed to exaggerate his vigor, to assure the court that Ferdinand was still capable of ruling, still capable of fathering heirs. Others were bribed by Carlists to spread the opposite rumor, that the king was impotent, diseased, incapable of producing a legitimate line. Medicine itself became a weapon in the war of succession. The hypocrisy was staggering. Priests who denounced liberalism in sermons secretly entertained offers from liberal generals. Nobles who signed decrees in Isabella's name sent letters of support to Don Carlos. Ministers who swore loyalty to Ferdinand leaked documents to his enemies. Every alliance was conditional, every oath temporary. Ferdinand's court was a place where nothing was sacred, where betrayal was not the exception, but the rule. And through it all, Ferdinand himself grew ever more grotesque. Bloated, barely able to walk, he shuffled through the halls of the palace like a spectre. His paranoia sharpened. He accused ministers of treason, dismissed loyal generals on suspicion alone, and surrounded himself with flatterers who soothed his fears. Yet even in his madness, he could sense the rot beneath him. He knew that when he died, the daggers sheathed, for now, would finally be drawn. Outside the palace walls, the whispers of court scandal spread like wildfire. Pamphlets circulated describing Ferdinand as a monster king, mocking his deformities, hinting at his impotence, questioning Isabella's legitimacy. In taverns, peasants laughed bitterly at the idea of a child queen. In monasteries, monks prayed not for Isabella, but for Carlos. The king's grotesque body had become a symbol of Spain's grotesque fate, a kingdom deformed, divided, and devouring itself. This was the true horror of Ferdinand's court. Not only the paranoia of a dying king, but the hypocrisy of those who circled him. Each betrayal, each whispered conspiracy, each secret alliance brought Spain closer to civil war. Ferdinand's palace was not a seat of monarchy. It was a haunted house where every shadow concealed a traitor and every oath was a lie. And yet, the corruption of the court was only one part of Ferdinand's legacy. The real impact of his reign would be felt far beyond the palace walls, in the streets, in the churches, in the very fabric of Spanish society. For his cruelty, his deformity, and his paranoia did not die with him. They seeped into the culture of Spain itself, poisoning generations to come. The scandals of Ferdinand's court did not remain locked behind palace walls. They spilled into the streets, the taverns, the churches, and the fields, infecting the very soul of Spain. His grotesque body, his cruel policies, and his cursed dynasty became symbols that ordinary men and women could not ignore. For while kings may command armies and dictate laws, it is the people who carry their memory. And in the memory of the Spanish people, Ferdinand VII became less a monarch than a curse that deformed an entire society. Among the nobility, Ferdinand's reign was cloaked in hypocrisy. In public, they hailed him as protector of the throne, kissing his twisted hand, swearing oaths of loyalty to his daughter Isabella. In private, they mocked his grotesque body, his wheezing breath, his clumsy gait. They whispered that he was unfit to rule, that his deformities were God's punishment on the Bourbon bloodline. Satirical pamphlets, passed in secret, depicted the king as a bloated toad, clutching a crown far too large for his diseased head. The mockery was dangerous, but it spread all the same, carried by nobles who outwardly bowed, yet inwardly prayed for his death. For the common people, the experience was more visceral. Ferdinand's cruelty had touched their daily lives. Soldiers conscripted and sent to fight futile wars. Taxes raised to feed a court that squandered wealth. Executions staged as lessons in loyalty. In towns and villages, people no longer spoke of El Deseado, the desired one. Instead, they cursed his name. Mothers frightened disobedient children by invoking the king's image. Sleep, or Ferdinand will come for you. His grotesque presence seeped into folklore, transforming him from king to bogeyman, a spectral reminder of tyranny. Religion too played its part in shaping his legacy. Priests and bishops, eager to justify his absolute rule, painted Ferdinand as God's chosen instrument, ordained to crush heresy and preserve tradition. Sermons thundered against liberals, branding them enemies of both king and Christ. Yet this divine justification carried a darker implication. If Ferdinand was God's instrument, then his grotesque deformities were also divine judgment. Many ordinary Spaniards believed that God had cursed the king's body to reveal the corruption of his soul. Superstitious villagers whispered that Isabella's birth was not a blessing, but a test, a fragile child destined to inherit her father's curse. This belief in divine punishment gave rise to chilling myths. In rural Spain, tales spread that Ferdinand's deformities were the result of sins committed by his ancestors, that his monstrous body was proof of Bourbon decadence. Some claimed his blood carried the corruption of incest, others that his marriages were cursed by God for their cruelty. Whether true or not, these myths reflected a deeper truth. The people saw in Ferdinand's body a mirror of Spain itself, twisted, diseased, and stumbling toward ruin. The cultural impact went beyond fear and superstition. Ferdinand's obsession with crushing reform had poisoned Spain's intellectual life. Writers and philosophers were silenced, their works banned, their voices strangled. Universities were stripped of liberal professors, replaced by sycophants who preached obedience instead of inquiry. The arts stagnated under censorship. For a generation, creativity was smothered by Ferdinand's paranoia. Where other nations advanced into modernity, Spain sank deeper into decay, its brightest minds exiled or executed. At the same time, the loss of Spain's American colonies deepened the sense of betrayal. To commoners, Ferdinand had not only cursed the homeland, he had squandered the empire. The once mighty Spanish crown, which had ruled across oceans, now stood humiliated, presided over by a deformed king whose only legacy seemed to be blood and failure. And yet, despite the disgust, there was also fear. Ferdinand's cruelty had left scars that lingered long after his body was gone. People learned to whisper instead of speak, to suspect instead of trust. The paranoia of the palace bled into society itself. Neighbors spied on neighbors, taverns buzzed with informers, families hid their opinions in silence. The culture of suspicion that Ferdinand created did not die with him. It became a way of life, passed down like a curse from one generation to the next. By the time Ferdinand lay dying, Spain was already a haunted kingdom, haunted not only by his grotesque image, but by what he had done to its spirit. Nobles were corrupted by hypocrisy, clergy tainted by complicity, commoners broken by fear and poverty. His reign had twisted the very fabric of Spanish life, creating a society where betrayal, censorship, and superstition were the norm. And when he finally died, the people did not weep. They watched. They waited. They wondered what horrors would come next. For Ferdinand's passing did not free them. It opened the gates to civil war. But before that war erupted, there came a moment when everything broke, when Ferdinand's paranoia and cruelty crossed a line too far, and Spain itself began to turn against him. That moment was the turning point, and it would seal not only Ferdinand's fate, but the fate of his dynasty. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand VII was a king, in name only. His body had become a grotesque parody of monarchy, swollen with fluids, ravaged by gout, rotting from within. The once desired one could no longer mount a horse, could barely walk across his chambers. He was carried on litters like a corpse that refused to die, his breaths wheezing, his face puffed and discolored, his legs ulcerated and bandaged. Every movement brought screams of agony that echoed through the palace corridors. Ministers waited outside his chamber not for commands, but for death rattles. Yet Ferdinand clung to life with the same stubborn cruelty that had defined his reign. His paranoia, sharpened by illness, turned the palace into a fortress of fear. He believed enemies lurked in every corner, liberals plotting his overthrow, Carlists sharpening daggers, even physicians conspiring to hasten his end. He changed doctors constantly, accusing each in turn of treachery, demanding impossible cures. The palace smelled of incense and rot, of holy water sprinkled over ulcers that refused to close. The grotesque spectacle of his illness soon spilled into the public eye. Courtiers could no longer conceal the truth. The King of Spain was not a man, but a bloated carcass still clinging to power. Pamphlets spread through Madrid mocking his deformities. Ferdinand depicted as a swollen frog, gasping for air, his crown slipping from his head. Where once he had been hailed as a savior, he was now ridiculed as a monster. In taverns, commoners whispered that his body was the truest symbol of Spain, diseased, decayed, collapsing under its own corruption. And yet, even as death closed in, Ferdinand forced his court into humiliating displays of loyalty. Nobles were summoned to his bedside to swear oaths to Isabella, the fragile daughter he had named as heir. One by one they knelt before the dying king, pressing trembling lips to his swollen hand, swearing allegiance not out of devotion, but out of fear. Everyone knew the truth. The moment he exhaled his final breath, those oaths would shatter like glass. But Ferdinand demanded the ritual, clinging to the illusion of control even as his body betrayed him. It was during these final days that betrayal came to the surface. His ministers, sensing the inevitable, began to position themselves for the aftermath. Some secretly reached out to Don Carlos's faction, promising support if the pretender triumphed. Others forged alliances with Queen Maria Cristina, swearing loyalty to Isabella while demanding rewards. Soldiers stationed in Madrid whispered their loyalties in hushed voices, their commanders bribed by both sides. The palace was no longer a seat of governance. It was a morgue where factions circled like vultures. Even his own family was drawn into the treachery. Maria Cristina, outwardly the grieving wife, worked feverishly behind the scenes. She brokered deals with liberal generals, secured promises of protection, and prepared for the moment when Ferdinand's corpse would still be warm and the throne would pass to her daughter. To the dying king's face, she wept. Behind his back, she maneuvered with ruthless calculation. Ferdinand, fevered and delirious, seemed to sense the betrayal, but could do nothing to stop it. He raged at ministers, cursed at priests, accused his brother Carlos of plotting his murder. He muttered conspiracies into the darkness, lashing out at shadows. Courtiers who dared approach his bedside described a grotesque sight. The king writhing, in his sheets, gasping for air, eyes bulging with terror, a body that looked more corpse than man. He screamed of enemies at the door, of daggers in the dark, of poison in his cup. It was as though his paranoia had finally consumed him entirely, leaving only a husk of fear. The moment that sealed his fate, and that of his dynasty, came not in war, but in his sick room. As his illness worsened, physicians confessed privately that nothing could be done. The king's flesh was decomposing while he still breathed. His body oozed with infection. His limbs were so swollen he could not be moved without cries that shook the walls. Spain's ruler had become a grotesque spectacle, a monarch who embodied death even before he died. For the people, this was the turning point. They no longer feared him, they mocked him. Where once he had ruled by terror, now he inspired only disgust. The image of Ferdinand, bloated, delirious, grotesque, spread across Spain as proof that the monarchy itself was cursed. Commoners spit when his name was spoken. Soldiers questioned whether they would fight for Isabella at all. Even among the clergy, some dared whisper that his suffering was God's punishment. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand finally succumbed. Surrounded by trembling courtiers and his calculating queen, he exhaled his last diseased breath. The desired one was gone, but the nightmare he left behind had only just begun. With his death, Spain erupted into the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict born of the very paranoia, deformity, and cruelty that had defined his reign. This was the turning point. The moment when Ferdinand's grotesque body and collapsing mind became not just a personal tragedy, but a national disaster. His deathbed was not an ending. It was the spark that set Spain ablaze, and in the aftermath, the true weight of his curse would be felt. In the legacy he left behind, in the dynasty he shattered, and in the blood that would be spilled for generations to come. When Ferdinand VII's bloated corpse was finally lowered into the royal tombs, Spain did not find peace. His death did not heal the wounds of his reign, it tore them open. The body of the king rotted in silence, but the legacy he left behind was louder than cannon fire. Within days, Spain descended into civil war. The First Carlist War, 1833-1840, erupted almost immediately. Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, declared himself the rightful king, rejecting the pragmatic sanction that had named Isabella heir. Absolutists rallied behind him, convinced that a female monarch was an abomination. Liberals and moderates, desperate to preserve the fragile promise of reform, swore loyalty to Isabella under the regency of her mother, Queen Maria Cristina. The war was brutal, savage and drawn out. Spanish fighting, Spaniard, brother fighting brother, priests, blessing armies on both sides. Towns were burned, peasants slaughtered, villages torn apart. Ferdinand had left behind not a kingdom, but a battlefield. This civil war was his most enduring curse. The divisions he had deepened, between absolutists and liberals, between tradition and reform, became rivers of blood that would flow for decades. The Carlist Wars haunted Spain throughout the 19th century, flaring again and again like a festering wound that refused to heal. Each new uprising, each new rebellion, could trace its roots back to the grotesque reign of Ferdinand VII, the deformed monarch who had poisoned the future of his own dynasty. His daughter Isabella II, proclaimed queen at just 3 years old, inherited not a throne, but a storm. Her reign was marked by instability, scandal, and constant uprisings. She was forever overshadowed by the monstrous image of her father, the king whose deformities had become Spain's fate. Critics mocked her as unfit, corrupt, cursed, just as they had mocked him. The Bourbon dynasty, weakened by Ferdinand's paranoia and desperate decrees, stumbled through the century like a wounded animal, barely surviving. Historians would not be kind to Ferdinand. Chroniclers described him as one of the most disastrous monarchs in Spanish history, a man whose cruelty, incompetence, and grotesque body symbolized the decay of an entire nation. Some called him the worst king Spain ever endured, others the gravedigger of the empire. Even sympathetic voices struggled to find redemption in his reign. His only surviving legacy, they admitted, was chaos. Evidence of his horror lingers even today. Satirical cartoons from the 19th century survive, mocking his deformities, portraying him as a bloated frog or a dying monster clutching a broken crown. Medical accounts describe his gout, his ulcers, his obesity, his failing organs. Letters from ministers reveal the paranoia, the betrayals, the whispered conspiracies that poisoned his court. His reign was not only remembered, it was documented in grotesque detail, a cautionary tale preserved for posterity. The lessons of Ferdinand's rule were grim, but clear. Power built on paranoia collapses. Cruelty does not preserve a kingdom. It rots it from within. A dynasty cannot survive on fear alone. Future rulers in Spain and across Europe studied his legacy as a warning. Some heeded it, many did not. The cycles of tyranny and betrayal he embodied would repeat themselves again and again in Spanish history. And yet, perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy lies not in politics, but in psychology. Ferdinand VII became a symbol of how a ruler's body can shape a nation's fate. His deformities were not merely personal afflictions, they became public metaphors, understood by nobles, peasants, and clergy alike as proof of a cursed bloodline. His grotesque body, twisted and diseased, was remembered as the mirror of Spain itself, a kingdom corrupted, swollen, and collapsing. When people spoke of Ferdinand after his death, they did not recall victories or reforms. They recalled the sight of a king too deformed to rule, too cruel to love, too paranoid to trust. His legacy was not triumph, but terror. Not glory, but grotesque decay. And yet, even in this legacy of horror, questions remain. Was Ferdinand truly the monster history remembers? Or was his monstrosity exaggerated by enemies, magnified by myth, and distorted by scandal? In the end, perhaps the line between truth and nightmare is thinner than we imagine. And that is the shadow Ferdinand VII left behind. A legacy as grotesque, ambiguous, and haunting as the man himself. The image is unforgettable. Ferdinand VII, bloated and rotting, gasping on his deathbed, clutching his infant daughter as if she were the last fragile thread binding a cursed dynasty together. Around him stood courtiers with forced expressions, some trembling with fear, others calculating their next move, all waiting for the Monster King to finally exhale his last breath. This was not a noble death, not the serene passing of a monarch surrounded by loyal subjects. It was a grotesque spectacle of decay, betrayal, and dread. And yet, his death was only the beginning. The wars that followed, the blood spilled in his name, the dynastic curse that haunted Isabella II, all of it flowed from Ferdinand's diseased reign. His deformities became more than flesh, they became prophecy. His paranoia became more than madness, it became policy. His cruelty became more than tyranny, it became Spain's inheritance. But what does Ferdinand's monstrous fate mean to us today? Perhaps it is a reminder that history does not simply move forward in triumphs and progress. It also festers. It rots. It punishes nations for the sins of their rulers. When power is clung to by men who cannot let go, when cruelty becomes governance, when paranoia replaces trust, the consequences do not die with the ruler. They linger. They poison generations. In the grotesque image of Ferdinand's body, swollen and broken, we see more than a king's downfall. We see a warning. Modern tyrants too cling to power despite illness, corruption, or madness. Modern societies too can be crippled by leaders who cannot see beyond their own survival. And like Ferdinand, such rulers often leave behind not stability, but war, not legacy, but ruin. Still, questions remain. Was Ferdinand truly the monster chroniclers describe, or was he the victim of propaganda, his deformities exaggerated, his paranoia amplified by enemies? Did Spain collapse because of him, or was he merely a symptom of a deeper sickness? The answers are buried beneath layers of myth, rumor, and memory. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. That sometimes history's monsters are not entirely born, nor entirely made, but something in between. So what would you have done, standing in that death chamber, watching the most deformed king of Spain clutch his heir? Would you have sworn loyalty or whispered treason? And what other monstrous secrets lie hidden, waiting to be unearthed in the shadows of history?